Okay, colleagues, and it seems that we are live. Okay. Ras. I'm just checking if the sound is working. Okay. Excellent. And we're live. So, colleagues, today we have a very special class. Today we're going to talk about possibly the greatest book ever written. Certainly one of the most important books in the history of Western philosophy. Plato's Republic. So, where shall we begin? Well, let me start somewhere. Hopefully, this will get going in a second. First of all, I want to stress the following thing. See, I kind of feel intimidated giving a lecture on such a venerable philosopher as Plato for the following simple reason. It's like when you've been reading Plato for a while and reading literature on Plato, you realize that Plato, more so than other philosophers, that there are different ways of understanding his philosophy. Plato, among other things, writes dialogues, so this actually increases the difficulty of knowing exactly what he has on his mind. I will talk about this in a minute. But like in general, we have to keep in mind that there are different perspectives. Philosophy is not about having one right answer. Philosophers in general do not trade in knockdown arguments. And again, as I mentioned, the ethics of the University of London in general presupposes that there is no such thing as the right answer, that there are better or worse arguments. And any position, in principle, is possible as long as you provide good arguments for it. And again, the very important idea of this course that we are taking here is not to indoctrinate you into a certain position. It's not, let's say, to get you to agree with my particular views. Who cares about that, right? The purpose of this course, I mean, like, it's not just who cares about that. I don't have the answers. I am the first person to tell you this. I do not have the answers. This is part of the reason why I teach, why I do philosophy, and as a way of doing philosophy, why I teach philosophy, because I want to get at the answers myself. If I had the answers, I would sort of move on and do something else, broadly speaking, right? But, it seems that human condition is such that we're in it for a long time. We don't have answers yet. We've been debating for more than 2,500 years, and still the basic questions are not answered. And so, in general, again, what I'm driving at is that in philosophy in general, again, I'm not trying to get you to agree with me or to get you to, to acquire a certain belief, let's say, right? But the ultimate purpose of this course is to get you thinking. And this is very much in the spirit of Socrates, as far as, we can trust Plato, his portrayal of Socrates. This is exactly what Socrates was trying to do, to try to get people to think. Try to get people to think for themselves, and seeing this value of the argument itself, that the opinion, even if it is correct, unless it is your own opinion and unless you can give reasons for it, in a deep sense, it is defective or maybe even worthless. So it's not important to have the right opinion, but much more important to have a good argument. Sorry, I talk for too long about this, but that's the idea. So again, this course is not about giving you answers, but about helping you develop your own perspective and providing arguments. And so I talked about this last time. Okay, let me spend 1 second on this. Right, philosophy as an open-ended, perpetually open-ended, dialogical, public, cumulative, and hopefully progressive, although we cannot really guarantee that. Okay, so today we continue on from last time. We talked a little bit about the sophists. So let me talk about the historical background. And so we're going to talk about, mostly we're going to talk about Plato for reasons I'll mention in a second, but for both Socrates and Plato, the relevant historical background is a time of war and crisis. And Klosko actually begins his chapter by talking about this, how very often political philosophy comes to the fore in the time of crisis. Like, as long as everything is just going according to plan, people can just live with simple, straightforward, traditional values. They don't tend to question them. But in the time of crisis, in the time of civil war, right, these kinds of questions like what is justice, what is piety, what is virtue, these kinds of questions come to the fore. You can no longer take it for granted that that everybody can understand and everybody can agree on, what justice is, or what it means to be a good person. And so I would say, again, there are many wars and they're important. And in general, one has to remember that the history of mankind, to a large extent, is a history of warfare. And this is especially true at the time of Plato and Aristotle, the constant wars. And as soon as Peloponnesian War ends, there are other wars. There's wars of Theban supremacy. And then Alexander, not Alexander the Great, but Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, begins to jostle for power. So it's like Greeks go to war constantly, this, and especially threat of war. This is going to be an important topic I'll come back to, because when Plato is trying to imagine what a perfect city looks like, right, he has to take war into account. And part of the reason why he has to do that is because when he looks outside the window, that's what he sees: war. And so a Peloponnesian War is this great and horrible conflict between Athens and Sparta, which lasted for almost 30 years, and it was incredibly bloody and it was incredibly ruthless, especially towards the end. In general, the common Greek standards of morality were cast by the wayside, and certain things that were quite unthinkable in the early years of the war became routine by the end of the war. Torture, imprisonment, murder, rape, selling people into slavery, all that kind of thing. So, wonderful quote. I think it's from Thucydides. I need to find this quote. It's kind of I'll put it up in a later lecture when he talks about how towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, the sentiments, in general, morality was destabilized to such an extent that all the normal human virtues were turned upside down. And let's say moderation, like if you are trying to be moderate or level-headed, this was taken as a sign of maybe you are a traitor, or maybe you're a coward, or maybe you're plotting something. So it's like either you have to be like sort of extremely ruthless, or you are immediately suspect. And so this is the Peloponnesian War. But also we have to remember that this was the war between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. But also sort of the tumult, the chaos caused by the war, also led to outbreak of civil wars within the cities. And this is important to remember. And again, I don't mean to spend too much time on history, but I think it's important to reflect on history as well, right? So in Athens of Socrates and Plato, it seems, as far as historians tell us, there was a group of people, a group of large, I don't want to say large, but a group of powerful aristocrats who actually wanted Athens to lose. It's a phrase, fifth column, it's quite applicable. So as far as we can tell, they actually would prefer Athens to lose, and they hoped that Spartans would install some kind of pro-Spartan oligarchic regimes with them at the head of Athens. So they wanted defeated Athens with them at the helm, with them ruling defeated Athens. Then, they would prefer that to Athenian democracy winning, right? And this is more or less what, again, it's hard to say because, no news reporters back in the day, and this is a horribly chaotic time. But, as soon as Spartans won, one option on the table, by the way, was complete and total destruction of Athens. Kill all men and sell all women and children into slavery. And the only reason why Spartans didn't do that is because they were afraid. Again, think of realism and international relations. They were afraid that this would give too much power to Thebes and Corinth. And they kept Athens, it seems, as this balancing act. So this is what saved the Athenians. This kind of gruesome fashion, a very depressing story, right? But indeed, so and they have installed this so-called oligarchy of the 30, or came to be known as the 30 tyrants. And among them were close Plato's associates. And this is an important topic that we're going to come back to in a second. That Plato was actually friends with some of these anti-democratic politicians. Again, like Critias, whom we talked about in the previous seminars and in the previous lecture. Critias and Charmides. Also, there was another very famous Athenian politician, Alcibiades, Alciviad, who was also implicated in potential anti-democratic sentiments, and so he has a very illustrious career. Unfortunately, no time to go into this right now. But again, so all of this has to be kept in mind. Okay, so this is by way of historical background. So let's talk about Plato now. So the most important thing about Plato is that Plato does not write treatises. Plato writes dialogues. And again, I begin with Plato, not with Socrates, for a reason, because Socrates never wrote anything, as far as we can tell. We don't have any writings surviving from Socrates. And first and foremost, when we talk about Socrates in a course like this, we are talking about a character in Plato's dialogue. So let me begin with Plato. So again, Plato was a son of a wealthy and prominent aristocratic family who traced their lineage back to the great Athenian statesman Solon. By all accounts, it's not like we have many accounts, but, according to historical tradition, Plato was very talented. She possibly wanted to become a playwright, again, with a family like that, was probably destined for greatness, but met Socrates and was charmed by him. Plato himself, well, again, within the dialogues, Socrates insists that he was never a teacher to anyone because he knows that he knows nothing. So should we call Plato Socrates, Socrates, Plato's teacher, is a complicated story. But you see, again, so we have this idea in Socrates, Socrates says, I know that I know nothing, right? And it seems that, the different ways to interpret this phrase, not necessarily the most historically accurate, but I think definitely the most fruitful way to interpret this phrase is this admission of this open-mindedness, commitment to open-minded dialogue. Skepticism, again, in the sense of the word skeptikos that I talked about last time, inquirer, somebody who keeps asking questions and is never satisfied with subpar arguments, right? So if this was truly the mindset of Socrates, then it stands to reason that Plato would not write treatises but write dialogues, because dialogues allow for this open-endedness, right? So every conclusion is intermediate, and also in the course of the dialogue you can present different sides of the equation, and I think it's very important. It's a very deeply controversial argument, and you should recognize this as a controversial argument, but I think that Plato was more sympathetic to the sophists than most people realize. And again, this is my own personal opinion. Do take it with a grain of salt, although I think there's a lot to it. And the most immediate reason for it being that Plato chose to preserve the arguments of the sophists. We know so much about the sophists because Plato wrote so eloquently about them. And I think at the very least he wanted us to take their arguments seriously. Did he agree with the arguments themselves? That's a more complicated question. But you see, again, there's this popular conception of Plato, and this is what I have, at the bottom of my slide, that Plato is not a Platonist. That there's this Neoplatonic synthesis which originated roughly 500 years after Plato died. And, these are the people who read Plato religiously, who wanted to make Plato into a dogmatist philosopher with this very, very, what's the right phrase, unambiguous dogmatic doctrine. And, I think it's an interesting take. The most important name among the Neoplatonist philosophers, so-called philosopher called Plotinus from Alexandria, writing in Roman times, and I think Plotinus is an interesting philosopher in his own right and should be taken seriously. But I think as an interpreter of Plato, we should be careful. And also, one has to remember that there were different traditions of ancient understanding of Plato. There was an important, for a time, Plato's Academy was actually the seat of skepticism, so-called academic skepticism. When Ciceron, great Roman rhetorician and a philosopher, studied philosophy actually in Greece. He studied in Plato's Academy, so-called again academic skeptics. So there's again what I'm driving at is that there are different traditions of ancient traditions of interpretation of Plato. Okay, anyway, apologies. This is maybe too many details. Let's go back to okay, yeah. So this is just for fun, right? But I think I think this is very important. This is one task of intellectual development, to see complexity where other people see simplicity. Sort of, and Plato was not a Platonist. We're not talking about Christian. We will talk a bit about Christianity. By the way, Klosko has a wonderful chapter on the history of early Christianity. So I've actually included this phrase about Jesus here for a reason. If you wanna read about that, again, Klosko has a wonderful presentation. If you read the chapter, again, it mostly relies on our historical reconstruction of early Christian communities. It absolutely have very little to do with what is known as Christianity today. I think it's an instructive reading in all sorts of ways. Again, this sophisticated, manner, enlarging our perspectives. We will definitely talk about how Marx is not a Marxist. Shall we get to Heidegger? That's always a good question. Okay, so I talked about this already. So Plato is a skeptic again. So this, especially when we're going to talk about Plato's theory of forms or Plato's theory of ideas. The Greek word is eidos. I sometimes ask my students, does Plato believe in the theory of forms? Does he have faith? Does he have proof? And probably he doesn't have faith, he doesn't have proof, but he has a hypothesis. He has a working hypothesis. Anyway, and so also we should also keep in mind in general, and especially when we read Plato's dialogues, dialogues have these layers of meaning. Again, dialogue is not a treatise. You don't get a clear conclusion in the dialogue. In fact, many of Plato's dialogues end with no conclusion at all. It's like there are different arguments on both sides, and at the end of the day, Socrates sort of throws his hands up in the air and says, well, who knows what is the right approach? We've seen some arguments on both sides, it's unclear. And again, think back to Gorgias, again, or Protagoras, this idea of making the weaker argument the stronger, that there are two arguments on every issue, on every, two equally convincing arguments on opposing sides of every issue, basically, right? And a very important 20th century philosopher, Leo Strauss, and we'll talk about Strauss, especially next year, as an interpreter of Locke, for example, or of Hobbes. He talks about this esoteric nature of philosophy. So esotericism, esoteric means hidden nature, right? Especially in political philosophy, there may be certain truths that should not be told to the public at large. So again, especially like we talked about the sophists last time, right? And this idea that there is no such thing as universal morality, that justice is just the interest of the stronger. But if you actually tell, and it may be true, but if you tell it to the people, think back to Protagoras, right? Protagoras believes that justice is unnatural, justice is artificial, but if you tell it to the people, there will be horrible social consequences and everybody will suffer. So these things, these truths, Protagoras would say, should be kept a secret. And Leo Strauss kind of takes his cue from that, right? And proposes that we treat maybe all of political philosophy as like that all political philosophers had in some way to try to protect themselves, or not themselves, but protect people, protect the uninitiated, protect the person in the street. Because again, there may be philosophical truth, but the person in the street will misunderstand, and this will lead to bad consequences. So again, this is an important idea, especially applicable, I think, to Plato. Although, I have to tell you, I find Strauss's interpretation of Plato interesting, but I disagree with it. Maybe we'll talk about this some other time. So finally, let's talk about Socrates, because for a reason, Socrates is usually the main character in Plato's dialogues. So first of all, we're faced with this huge Socratic problem, which is to say, who was historical Socrates? And to cut the long story short, we don't know. We have three basic sources, three primary sources, people who knew Socrates personally surviving, Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato. It's hard, and they paint some, fairly different pictures of Socrates. Can they be reconciled? We don't know. It's like, at the end of the day, you see, I think it's very important to understand, Socrates is not a religious prophet. Who cares about what historical Socrates thought? What we're interested in are the arguments. So I'm going to focus again on Socrates as he's presented by Plato. Whether Plato is accurately portraying Socrates or whether he's just imagining, I'm not going to care about that. But in general, you should be aware that it's a problem. So what is the picture that Plato, and again, so from now on, from this point onward, I am talking about Socrates as a character in Plato's dialogue, right? And I'm interested in the arguments. So Plato portrays Socrates, especially in Socrates' Apology, which is Socrates' defense speech in the Athenian court, where he's brought on charges of impiety and corrupting the young, right? Plato gives a picture of Socrates as a man who thought for himself and who was prepared, Socrates, who was prepared to overthrow long-cherished conclusions if he found they could not be substantiated by sound arguments. And Socrates, who taught others to do the same. So this is, I think, ultimately the value of the figure of Socrates for philosophy in general. In some sense, Socrates, regardless of what his positive views were, his philosophical methodology, I think, to a very large extent, underlies the methodology of all of Western political philosophy, although, again, obviously, people disagree, but he's a very important force. And especially, I like this phrase a lot, the unforced force of the better argument. So the only force that a free citizen should recognize is the unforced force of the better argument, peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. This is actually a phrase from a wonderful German philosopher who is still alive today, probably the most important philosopher who is still alive today, Jürgen Habermas. And again, so my German is a bit rusty, but it's something like der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, right? And in general, again, Klosko, I think, by and large, agrees with this characterization of Socrates. This idea that Socrates has this essential commitment to the open-ended nature of inquiry, not anti-dogmatic idea, skeptical in this sense, skepticism in a sense of anti-dogmatism, right? And Socrates had passionate beliefs. In fact, some of these beliefs he was prepared to die for. But yet, it seems that about his beliefs, he believed that they may turn out to be wrong. Sort of one of his important beliefs was that the soul, it seems in Plato's dialogue Phaedo, Socrates talks about how the soul is immortal. Does he know that? Like 100%? Probably not. But this is where the force of the better argument led him to. And up until the very last moment, he invites his friends, his interlocutors, to challenge his belief. He's about to drink poison, he's about to die, and yet he finds value. He wants, again, his friends to propose the best arguments against the immortality of the soul. Again, it's a very impressive, ominous, not ominous, but awesome picture. Anyway, so I keep talking about Socrates' execution. Let's talk about this some more, but I want to keep this short because I want to get to Plato's Republic as soon as possible. So in the year 399, Socrates was found guilty by the city of Athens, and so as Diogenes Laertius, who is writing hundreds of years after Socrates' death, so this should be taken with a grain of salt, the charge supposedly against him is that he's guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and of introducing new divinities, and he's also guilty of corrupting the young. So this is very important. Socrates as corrupting the young, and also of introducing new divinities. And there are two aspects, and I want to talk about them both again. So first of all, as I mentioned last time, there seems to be this old quarrel between religion and philosophy, which goes back to the most ancient times. Again, the poets or the religious prophets, right? And these are the same thing, the same people when we talk about ancient Athens, right? So the religious prophets do not speak in their own name. they do not believe in the power of human reason. They do not believe in skepticism for, within standard religious discourse is supposed to be a vice. Skepticism is supposed to be a sin. You're supposed to have faith, right? And again, poets such as Homer or Hesiod, or you can think of prophets in other religious traditions, right? Prophets do not speak in their own name. They speak for the divinity, right? Whereas philosopher is supposed to, only recognize the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, right? Pure reason, pure logic, or maybe observations. This kind of thing. So this puts, I think, rightfully so, philosophy, at odds with a certain kind of essential religious impulse. And since the earliest times, we can see how those philosophers who do believe in God or gods, they will paint different pictures of the gods. Very famously, I think it was Xenophanes. So we have Xenophon and Xenophanes. These are two different people. So Xenophanes has this, I should have added this to the slides, has this criticism of Greek religion. He says that if animals had gods, they would depict gods in the shape of animals. And he says people whose skin is black, who live in Africa, depict gods as black-skinned, right? So Xenophanes has this criticism of popular religion, saying that religion is anthropomorphic. Again, this kind of should echo this idea of Critias, that it's not gods who make men, but men who invent gods. Again, you see, like in the Bible, God makes men in his own image. God makes men in his own image. And here, Xenophanes and Critias say, no, it is people who invent myths about the gods and make gods anthropomorphic, make gods human-like, with human qualities, but also with human vices. Think about Zeus, who cheats on his wife Hera, who is overcome by desire and passions, and you can think of maybe similar stories about gods in other traditions. Let me not continue along that line, but something definitely to think about, I think, right? And Socrates, we'll talk about this. Well, maybe I'll mention this later, or maybe I should talk about this now. Socrates has this really interesting dialogue, Euthyphro. Plato tells a dialogue about Socrates, where Socrates calls into question traditional Greek beliefs, talking about how Homer and Hesiod represent gods as being deeply immoral. And ultimately, it seems what Socrates is driving at is that there has to be an objective standard of goodness. There has to be an objective standard of goodness which is universal and which is above the gods, to which even the gods subscribe. That we should do not what gods tell us. Think about, let's say, 10 Commandments in the Bible. This is a slavish submission. This is not what the philosophers should do. Philosophers should do what is objectively good, and everybody should obey that, including the gods. That's the basic story of this dialogue, Euthyphro. I'll talk about this later on. But again, you have to see, this puts Socrates in clash with the popular opinion of his day, right? And Greeks were very superstitious, especially in times of war, in times of crisis. There was a horrible plague in the city of Athens, disease, right? Rampaging disease at the time of the Peloponnesian War, and many people thought that the plague was caused by people being impious, being sacrilegious, sort of not reverent enough in the face of the gods. And so it's quite plausible that the jury who found Socrates guilty, that they were simply superstitious, understandably so, because that was the state of knowledge back in the day. People were simply afraid that if they allow somebody like Socrates to go around and question traditional religious beliefs, that gods are going to punish them, right? And it's like, this is an important point. And here, we should try to see both sides of the argument. And different students will have different opinions about this. I mean, you can ask students, like, is Socrates guilty? And some people would be willing to say, no, Socrates is not guilty, freedom of religion is essential. And some people would say, no, Socrates is guilty because, you should not offend religious sentiments for this or that reason. And I want you to see both sides of the argument. Obviously, the core value in philosophy is this open-mindedness, but on the other hand, we kept talking with Protagoras, and we'll talk about today with Plato, about how religion plays an important role in society. And again, you see, Leo Strauss talks about esotericism, that okay, maybe religion is false, but should you tell it to a person in the street who is not a professional philosopher, who is not prepared necessarily to understand the conclusion? Could it be that if you tell to the person in the street that religion is false, maybe bad things will happen to them? Because, people who are not, fully intellectually developed, maybe are unprepared to face the truth like that. And again, this idea of a noble lie, an ideology, yes, technically speaking, which is not true, but which helps hold society together. Something. We talked about with Protagoras last time about something similar. So this is charge number one, and one has to understand that disrespecting the gods is a political offense. Disrespecting the gods is a political offense for the Athenians. Again, that's the way the charge was phrased, especially if you think of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, of course. Sort of idea that if you disrespect the gods, the plague will be visited upon the city, will lose in war, bad things are going to happen. Anyway, and likewise, when we talk about corrupting the young, again, this open-endedness, this open-mindedness, right? This willingness to ask questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What is piety? Again, you see, Socrates doesn't simply want to go back to traditional morality. He wants to engage with the sophists. He wants to, again, in this sense, Socrates was something of a sophist. He also does not want to recognize simply traditional morality. He wants good arguments, right? So he agrees with the sophists, at least in this negative formulation, that we need to think for ourselves, right? And sophists may come to different conclusions, saying that there's no such thing as justice. Socrates maybe wants to say that there is such a thing as justice, but it is important to provide an argument. You cannot just believe that just because somebody told you that. Like, you need to substantiate it. And you can ask this question: isn't this corrupting the young? Isn't this subversive? Again, if you think about this, in time of war, imagine you're a soldier in the army, and tomorrow you go off into battle, and Socrates meets you. And again, we have dialogues like these, dialogues that Plato writes, sort of in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Socrates would talk to generals, like Nicias, for example, who was an important Athenian general, and he would ask Nicias, do you know what is courage? And Nicias cannot give him an answer. Could it be that this can have, a negative effect on Athenian fighting ability? That sort of, and notice, especially if this happens in public, imagine Socrates asks one of the leading generals, one of 10 generals at Athens, what is courage? And the general cannot give him a reply. And soldiers see that some person, random person in the street, asks your superior, what is courage? A general, what is courage? And the general cannot give a reply. Could this be that in the eyes of the soldiers, the authority of the general, goes down, basically, right? Could this have a negative impact on the fighting spirit? Again, you see this kind of this anti-patriotic, this problematic nature of philosophy, that to be philosophical could lead to, if you sort of to pursue argument wherever it leads, this could lead to some damage to the city, and like a very direct damage, like losing a war. And it's kind of, on the one hand, philosophers want to say, no, but truth is more important. But on the other hand, one has to realize that philosophers can only philosophize because they are fed, clothed, and protected by the city at the end of the day. Because if Athens loses and all males are killed, Socrates is killed too. If all males are sold into slavery, Socrates is sold into slavery, and he cannot be a philosopher anymore and engage in this. So this is kind of problem. And so when we talk about this, Socrates corrupting the young, Klosko says that, technically speaking, in Klosko's own opinion, Socrates was corrupting the young for exactly the reasons I'm laying out right now. And very famously, Hegel, we'll talk about Hegel later on, Hegel thought that Socrates was correct in his own right, but within the given historical situation, the Athenians had to execute him. So Hegel is of the opinion that even though Socrates' ideas are ultimately correct and important, especially for us today, but back in the day, the historical situation was such that Athenians had to execute Socrates, that it was the right thing to do. And we'll ask the same question about Plato, because basically the idea is somebody like Socrates, is such a person going to be tolerated in Plato's Republic? It's not. The answer is not clear. It's not clear. In Plato's ideal city, would you allow somebody like Socrates just to go around and ask people these potentially subversive questions? Not to mention that there's another dialogue called Crito, in which Socrates presents the case of Athenian laws against himself. And again, remember, Socrates drank the poison willingly. So in some sense, maybe even Socrates himself, the way Plato portrays him, recognizes that the Athenians, have a certain right to do what they did. Although, I meant to make a separate slide about this, but again, it's like we have to remember what the Athenians did. The jury found him guilty. And Socrates thought he was not guilty. In fact, he thought that he was doing a great service to Athens. And Socrates had this very uncompromising character. Basically, because the way Athenian courts worked, you have 501 jurors, so 500 plus one person, to avoid stalemates. And the accusers propose a penalty, and the defendant proposes a penalty. And the accusers proposed the penalty of death, and the defendant, Socrates, proposed for the rest of his life, that the Athenians feed him. In fact, that they provide Olympic banquets reserved for winners of Olympic Games for the rest of his life. So it's like, when we say that Athenians killed Socrates, it's a bit of an exaggeration, because Socrates gave him a choice: either glorify me as the winner of the Olympic Games or kill me. So it's like, it's a complicated story. Anyway, but of course, in the Apology, Socrates himself, he says that the most important reason why people hate me is because I make important people look stupid in public, because I expose this problem that people do not know what they're talking about. That even the upholders of traditional morality, they cannot give an account of it. This is Socrates' own explanation of why he is found guilty. But and this is very interesting, because Plato in the Apology does not mention this even in a single sentence. I'm not sure what to make of it. But it's quite likely that the real reason, even though again it's not mentioned in our historical sources, but it's quite likely that the main reason was this anti-democratic connection, because Socrates was known to be friends with Alcibiades, Critias, and Charmides, maybe with some other figures, but these three names are probably three biggest names, and all these three people Critias and Charmides were members of the 30 Tyrants, and Alcibiades was a very problematic politician. You can do your own research. At some point in the Peloponnesian War, Alcibiades defected to Sparta and actually helped Spartans, and then he defected to Persia and helped Persians. And he was a known associate of Socrates. In fact, he was actually in love with Socrates. Very important, socially important traditions of homosexuality in ancient Greek society. Although, as Alcibiades tells us, and he was, Alcibiades was like a rock star, and he actually tried to seduce Socrates, but Socrates was completely indifferent. Anyway, so very likely, this was might have possibly been the real reason why he was executed. Again, so you had this oligarchic coup. This almost a military junta established for a short period of time, and then the democratic opposition defeated them in battle, in the civil war, and democracy was restored. And then restored democracy engaged in this sort of revenge, spring cleaning, if you want. Okay, this is slightly too long, but yeah, just in one sentence, let me talk about this social history of ideas, because we'll talk about this. How Jerry Cohen, I mentioned this last time, a Marxist philosopher, talks about this aristocratic leanings of Plato and Aristotle, and maybe of Socrates as well. And that's a problem, because in every stage of history, the ruling ideas tend to be the ideas of the rulers, because the rulers, the aristocrats, are the ones who have the time, who have the leisure, who have the education and the means to engage in philosophical dialogue, and also to propagate their ideas, to publish their ideas. They're the ones who can cultivate a high literary style that will help, couch their ideas in beautiful language so that they get preserved for posterity. And this is kind of, I don't want to comment on this right now, but this is an insight most importantly associated with the name of Karl Marx, but I think there's something to it, although I don't want to reduce Socrates to just that. Okay, so here's the quote from last time, probably the most important. If you remember one thing about Socrates, this is probably the quote that you should remember this. The unexamined life is not worth living. And, okay, so, I talked about these things already, so let me just very briefly. So Socrates, again, was a very interesting figure, as far as we can tell, brave soldier, actually an outstanding patriot of Athens. He fought in war, and he had this legendary endurance and self-control and self-sufficiency. And so I have this cold, hunger, alcohol, and sex. He was completely indifferent to cold. He could withstand extremely freezing temperatures, as far as we can tell. He could tolerate extreme hunger. He could drink a lot, more than anybody else. He could outdrink anybody and not get drunk. And also, he's not exactly an ascetic figure, not exactly an ascetic figure, Socrates, because he had sex, he had a wife, he had many children, but he was like sort of indifferent to sex. Again, when the most beautiful person in all of Athens, Alcibiades, tried to seduce him, Socrates was just not in the mood. It's like Socrates, it seems, could control his appetites to an extraordinary degree. Like he was not a slave to his passion. And again, this idea of moral autonomy, that autonomy is required for morality. That if you do something because somebody else told you, like for example, let's go back to this example of the Bible. If you do something because God commanded you to, Socrates would say that's not moral. That's not moral. What is required for morality is autonomy, that you think and decide for yourself. This is the idea. And okay, so this care of the self, care of the soul. Again, I talked about this last time. How the Greeks thought that philosophy should be to the soul what medicine is to the body. So yeah, and I'll talk about this periodization of the dialogues, and in general the picture that we get from the so-called. This is a controversial point because dialogues don't have dates attached to them, but some scholars believe that we can talk about the early dialogues in which Plato more accurately presents Socrates' ideas rather than Plato's own ideas, right? And so in the early dialogues, especially, again, we have this idea, quote from Socrates, I know that I know nothing. And again, the way he phrases it in the Republic is he says, this is a story about the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. And Socrates talks about how God, Apollo, through an oracle, talks about Socrates, that he is wise who, like Socrates, understands that human mind is limited and that ultimately, we should understand that our understanding is limited. I know that I know nothing in this sense. However, at the same time, Socrates does seem to have convictions. So this statement, I know that I know nothing, seems to not be completely sincere on Socrates' part, because it seems that he proposes, actually quite a number of positive doctrines. So the first one is that well, in no particular order, that the greatest good in life is to take care of one's soul, that the same way life is not worth living if your health is ruined. Again, imagine you have all the goods you want, all the power you want, but you have a horrible, excruciating condition, disease, right? Socrates would say, well, life would not be pleasant for you. You would not want to live in constant, pain if your body is ruined. In the same way, Socrates talks about if your soul is ruined, wealth and political power do nothing for you. And again, Socrates is going to insist on how wealth and political power can be means to certain ends if your soul is in a good condition. But if your soul is disorganized, then, if you have a lot of wealth, you will simply do a lot of damage to yourself. Okay, so the unexamined life is not worth living, yes. Also, again, very interesting position from Socrates, no one does wrong willingly. No one does wrong willingly. That actually all vice, all bad behavior, all evil in society comes from ignorance. And again, this controversial positions that injustice harms the doer of the injustice, and it is better to suffer injustice than to be unjust. Very controversial positions. And continuing from this, that there's one definite human excellence, that again, you see a knife, right? Let's imagine a knife. we know what it means to have a good knife. A good knife, which is the one that is strong, that cuts well. We know what is a good telescope. It's the one that's clear and allows you to see off into the distance. We know what is, let's say, a good car or something like that. And in the same fashion, Socrates says there is an objective ideal of what is a good human life, what it means to be a good human being. Again, this normative ideal. This is very anti-democratic and goes against our contemporary liberal ideas, right, about how, each person should find their own way in life. And Socrates insists, no. Human excellence, again, the Greek word is arete, sometimes translated as virtue, is one. And actually, this human excellence is derived from knowledge, from philosophy, from wisdom, right? And it leads to happiness. This is relationship. That in order to become an excellent human being, you have to engage in philosophy, understanding your life, giving an account of your life, and this will lead to happiness. Because unless you think about your life, knowledge is a necessary condition for happiness. Unless you know what you're doing, you cannot be reliably happy. By accident, maybe you could become happy, but becoming happy is a skill that one cultivates, and it's a skill. It's like a technical skill, like a science of happiness, if you want. And that's why knowledge is equal to excellence, is equal to happiness. And also, very importantly, this is crucially important. So in the dialogues, in Gorgias, for example, and in Plato's Republic, Socrates will talk about afterlife. He will talk about afterlife. So it seems that Socrates' working hypothesis is that the soul is immortal. And in other dialogues, he will talk about myths of how the good people are rewarded in the afterlife, and bad people, evil people, are punished in the afterlife. Socrates will often talk about how this is very important. It's very important to teach these kinds of ideas in order to stabilize society and social life. But in his serious arguments, he will never rely on this. So he would say, in some sense, this. When I talk about this excellence, which is knowledge, which is happiness, I am talking about happiness of this life. So even though he will mention the afterlife, he never relies on it as the ultimate argument. Like his argument, Socrates' argument, has to always work independently of the afterlife. So even if you assume that death is the end, his argument should still work. This is his very important assumption. And in fact, in the Apology, he talks about this. He says, we do not know what happens to us after we die. He says, it's quite possible that death is simply the end. It's like a dreamless sleep. Sleep with no dreams, kind of trying to imagine what complete nothingness is like. Okay. So, yeah, okay, I talked about all of these things. Again, this idea of midwife and gadfly. Yeah, should I talk about this now? Well, maybe in one sense, again, Socrates talks about how he sees his task in the city as a gadfly, as a fly who stings, and the sting is very painful. And therefore, he makes people think, he makes people reflect. He asks uncomfortable questions that make people think. And then as a midwife, akusherka, somebody who helps give birth to babies, but he says, I don't help give birth to babies, I help people give birth to ideas. So not babies, but ideas in this sense. A gadfly and a midwife. And again, so this Elenchus, this method of refutation, but it has a connotation of shame. That actually when Socrates refutes, asks uncomfortable questions to important people in public, there's an important pedagogical element of shame. That somebody like Nicias should be ashamed that he as a general cannot explain what courage is. So, in fact, Nicias may become mad because Socrates refutes him in public, and other people, are uncomfortable. But that's the point. Because this is what will make people think. Okay. Yeah, so I talked about this problem of euthyphro, again, Socrates insisting that we should not slavishly submit ourselves to the gods, but there should be a higher standard of morality to which even the gods adhere. Although maybe I should always, as always, with Socrates, put this with a question mark, because the dialogue, euthyphro, actually ends with an aporia. It ends with an impasse. It doesn't have a conclusion. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I talked about all of this, and I actually talked about how Hegel and Plato and Socrates and Crito, Athenians were right to execute Socrates. Yeah. So let me. I'm going to try to get to Plato as soon as possible, but let me just talk about this. So it's like we're going to meet two important ideas later on. One is the idea of positive freedom, and positive freedom basically means that to be sort of let me try to explain this. So human beings have a nature, and there's a certain definite way in which human beings become excellent. There's a certain definite way in which human beings become happy. So positive freedom as opposed to negative freedom. So negative freedom would be you are free to do whatever you want, but positive freedom is a freedom that allows you to realize yourself. So negative freedom would allow you to shoot yourself up with heroin or drink yourself to death. But positive freedom is specifically the freedom that allows you to develop yourself as a human being, develop your rich and varied abilities. Now, this presupposes a certain ideal of a human being, and this is judgmental again. And contemporary liberal discourse does not doesn't sit very well with it, right? Because we think that people. Well, I don't want to say we, but many people today think that people should be free. To pursue their own happiness in their own way. This is not exactly Socratic idea, and we will be coming back to this notion that many political philosophers will rely on a certain vision of what human nature is and of what makes people happy, and especially this notion of higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures and lower pleasures. That again, Socrates would say that higher pleasures are pleasures of philosophy, and again, positive freedom is freedom to do what? Freedom to engage in philosophy first and foremost, not freedom to drink yourself to death or sleep with whomever you want. No. Positive freedom is ultimately the freedom that again helps to develop the highest part of your soul, which is the reasoning part, the rational part, and human beings developing towards philosophy, and this would be the highest form of happiness. Again, Socrates, in one of Plato's dialogues, tells the story that as human beings, we're driven by desire, we're driven by love. And first we love beautiful objects, but then we learn to love beautiful people. But then we don't just love people as bodies, we begin to love people as souls. This is like a ladder, and you kind of love more and more beautiful things on the next, subsequent stages, right? So you go from objects to bodies to souls, but then you don't just love human souls, you love the idea of beauty itself. And in order to do that, sort of to thematize the idea of beauty itself, you have to be a philosopher. So, and this kind of the idea that sort of this kind of love brings the highest, the most lasting satisfaction. And sort of again, so I talked about this, how not life but good life, and life is worthless if health or soul is ruined. And so let me actually maybe switch this discussion, same idea but from a slightly different lens. So we talked about pleonexia last time, and pleonexia is this notion that human beings have this perpetual and restless, incessant desire to have more and more than others, to have more than your fair share. And again, it's like Socrates tells to Callicles, this is Calliclean ideal, right? And Socrates tells to Callicles, but isn't this self-defeating? Isn't this like trying to carry water in a sieve? It's like trying to carry something in a leaky jar. And Callicles says, yes, exactly. And when I want my jar to have as large hole as possible, and I want to pour through it, as much as I possibly can. So live your life to the fullest. And Socrates, it seems, has a very different ideal. So, and this Greek word ataraxia, which means something like calmness or tranquility. Literally, it means freedom from disturbance, freedom from perturbation. It's a calmer form of happiness. And, ataraxia can be explained in this wonderful phrase: he is not rich who has much, but he is rich who needs little. So Socrates is actually very poor. He is known almost like he lives almost like a hobo. Right? He doesn't wash very much. He has the cheapest clothes possible. Almost has no possessions. But he is happy. He is rich because he doesn't need all this luxury in order to be happy. Because he has trained his mind and body to appreciate the simple things in life. We'll talk later about tradition of ancient Cynics and ancient Epicureans. Maybe you've heard of Diogenes, who has allegedly lived in a barrel, also sort of following in the footsteps of Socrates in this respect, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we will actually talk about this idea of, again, higher, lower pleasures, these higher pleasures which are non-rival. I can be happy and tranquil, and you can be happy and tranquil at the same time. Like, you see, for Kallipolis, if I'm trying to have more money than everybody else, or more glory than everybody else, there can be only one number one. So the Kallikolian ideal of happiness is competitive. If I am happy, if I win, you must lose, right? For one person to win, somebody else must lose. But Socrates, I mean, like, if your goal in life is tranquility, then I can be tranquil, you can be tranquil, it doesn't bother me that you are more tranquil than I am. It's not a competition, on the one hand. And on the other hand, especially if we talk about happiness through philosophy, happiness especially, through engaging in this philosophical dialogue, here, this is a collaborative enterprise. It's a variable sum game, that we work in this together. It's a win-win situation. And again, John Stuart Mill would talk about this. He would say how, well, again, if you think of things like, I don't know, Wikipedia or public libraries, Mill is very serious about this, how this is going to make people happy. And, if I become a good scientist, right, you can become a good scientist too. And especially, this idea that how pure science can give people pleasure, how people would do, let's say, astronomy as a hobby because they enjoy it, right? If I'm a good astronomer and you're a good astronomer, this actually doesn't bother me. This actually helps me. The more better astronomers there are, the more we advance astronomy, and the more pleasure we derive from our astronomical exercises. Again, this is kind of non-competitive, non-rival ideal. And again, this is going to be very important. And, we'll talk about this later on in the course, but let me just mention three names. So Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, and actually Karl Marx. So when Karl Marx talks about communism, this is definitely an important assumption for Marx, that human nature ultimately is such that we are ultimately cooperative creatures, and sort of the highest pleasures that are available to us, highest pleasures that are available to human beings, pleasures of art, pleasures of philosophy maybe, but especially art, or literature. These kinds of activities, they are cooperative. Again, it's like, if you have a school of painters, we become better at painting collectively. Again, it's like teacher-student relationship, all this stuff. So I just wanted to get this out there. Again, Rousseau is explicitly going to talk about this ataraxia and pleonexia. Rousseau's terms for this are going to be more de soi and more proper. We'll talk about this later on. Okay. So, let me try, I don't have a lot of time, but let me try to at least give a basic presentation of Plato's argument in the Republic. So I've spent quite a lot of time talking about Socrates, more than I usually do, but I think it's valuable. I think these are all important ideas for us to keep in mind, and important backgrounds for what Plato is going to do. So I don't want to comment on this, but like in general, we have to be you should be aware that there's this periodization, potential, hypothetical, tentative periodization of Plato's dialogues. Sometimes they're divided into this early, later, middle, and later period. And the ultimate idea is going to be that in the early dialogues, Plato is trying to explain ideas of Socrates. In the middle dialogues, he's developing his own ideas, especially theory of forms. And then in the later dialogues, Plato maybe is criticizing his ideas of the middle period. And as in one later dialogue, very importantly, dialogue Parmenides, maybe he criticizes theory of forms. So again, it's dialogue, open-ended, so it's hard to say. But in this dialogue, again, important criticisms are advanced against the theory of forms. So if I'm not sure if you've heard about Plato's theory of forms, but you should be aware that the most important critic of Plato seems to be Plato himself. And likewise, there's a lot of criticism of the Republic. Especially some people like Karl Popper are going to advance arguments against the Republic as being a totalitarian book. Well, in Plato's probably Plato's last dialogue called the Laws, Plato seems to criticize his earlier views in the Republic, although we won't go into this. I'm just letting you know that there is this progression. Okay. So, we are going to switch gears now. And I want to, take this calmly, one step at a time. So let's talk about this wonderful book. So the name of the book is Republic. In Greek, politeia. Politeia. Politeia means regime, or constitution. So republic may not necessarily be the best translation of the Greek word, but that's what we have. It's a very complicated dialogue, in a sense that it has layers of meaning. It's like reading the Republic is like peeling an onion. Though I have to tell you that it takes a lot of time. I've been, this is my experience and the experience of many people I know. You can read the Republic year after year after year, and every time you find something deeper, something new. And many books are like that. Many great books are like that. But Republic is special. Republic is special. And there's a lot that Republic can teach us almost 2,500 years after it was written. It begins with an interesting sort of opening gambit. So Socrates is telling a story. He's describing the events. It's a narrated dialogue. And the opening lines, he says, "I went down to the Piraeus yesterday." And Piraeus is a port city of Athens. This is a very, rich line in terms of interpretation, potential interpretation. So, first of all, we have this image of going down, philosopher, going down from the philosophical heavens down into the political cave, right? Also, Piraeus is a port city. So port cities are, seedy, unseemly places. And he actually goes there to watch a festival of a new goddess being introduced into the Athenian pantheon. And among other things, this shows, I think, Socrates' open-mindedness. He is an Athenian patriot, but like the sophists, he's willing to entertain the possibility that, physis and nomos, that the laws and customs of different societies are different, and maybe other cultures have something to teach us. And he actually says in the opening lines of the Republic, he says he liked the Thracian performance of the Thracians. Right, so he's a commitment to open-mindedness. Yes, he's a patriot of Athens, but maybe we can learn something from the Thracians as well. Okay, so I mean, I think it's at some point, it's one of my dreams to actually read with the students Republic line by line and sort of take it slow, but probably take more than a year. Well, it may actually take a lifetime, but I'm just I just want to leave this hanging in the air. That sort of this dialogue is worth taking seriously. Okay. So let me sort of finish this musing tone and now get to the gist of the Republic and try to, as concisely as possible, explain what I think is the first surface meaning that we get from the dialogue. Again, the dialogue is complex, but let's talk about the surface. Let's talk about the surface. So what happens is that Socrates ends up in a house of a rich merchant whose name is Cephalus. It's an old and rich merchant. And so, people gather and they begin to talk. And Socrates, in a very impolite fashion, asks Cephalus, he says, "Oh, Cephalus, you are so very old. Tell us what it's like to be old. Tell us what it's like to be close to death." Right? Not necessarily the most politically correct question. But Cephalus is very calm. He says, "Oh, a lot of people suffer in the old age, but I am happy. And he says, sort of Socrates kind of implies that Cephalus is happy because he's very rich. And his wealth, in sort of this bourgeois fashion, allows him to pay off his debts. So Cephalus actually agrees with this. He says that wealth is definitely, if you have a good temperament, if you have the right kind of mental constitution, wealth is wonderful to have in old age. He says Cephalus says the following. He says, when I was a young person, I was overcome by desire. Desire for power, especially desire for women. And he says, this led me to, into a lot of conflicts with other people. I've made a lot of enemies when I was younger. And now that I'm older, I am so happy that I am no longer plagued by the desires of my youth, and I can pay off all of my debts. Debts to people, but also debts to the gods. And Cephalus is actually in the scene. He's wearing a garland. He has just come back from the garden performing sacrifices to the gods. So he uses his money to pay off the debts to people and also pay off the debts to the gods. And so he's a very unreflective person, and he's very much in the grips of this traditional morality. And again, his understanding of justice seems to be that, because this is the nominal topic of the dialogue. The dialogue is about what is justice, the Republic, right? And it seems that the answer is that Cephalus gives is paying your debts to people and to gods. And Socrates, it's also kind of an interesting point in the story. When Cephalus actually brings up this famous exchange with Sophocles, again, if you think about this in terms of ataraxia and pleonexia, in terms of Kallipolis, Sophocles, the famous Greek playwright, is being asked what it's like to be old, and especially in terms of these desires. Once you're old, how's your sex life? Are you still able to make love to a woman? And Sophocles says, oh, thank gods, no. Thank gods, this is all behind me. And I have become old and impotent, and therefore I have now become calm and happy. What would Kallipolis say about this? Kind of, again, I mean, in some sense you can see this clash between ataraxia and pleonexia. Again, it sounds, I'm sure, to a lot of people this sounds bizarre, right? But on the other hand, sort of, I think it's an important vision of what human happiness is like, to keep in mind. Again, this calmness of old age, when you are not plagued by your desires anymore. And Socrates is not necessarily saying that you should be impotent, right? I mean, he's fine with having sex, but it's like you should ask this question: do you control your sexual desire, or does your sexual desire control you? And this is, in some sense, maybe the most important argument against Kallipolis that Socrates has. Is it you who controls your desire, or are you just being enslaved by your desires? This sort of criticism of tyranny. Not Plato, but Socrates keeps talking about how the tyrant is the unhappiest of all men, because tyrants are ruled by their desires. Controversial position. Are all tyrants ruled by desires? It's not necessarily clear, but that's the point. Okay, and so anyway, we have this from Cephalus. We have this first definition of justice. That justice is paying your debts to gods and men. And Socrates, he's going to ask the same question. So we're going to have three definitions of justice from Cephalus, from Polemarchus, and from Thrasymachus. And Socrates is going to ask the same exact question to all three. And the question will have to do with knowledge. And the question will be, in a sense, like, how do you know, right? And to Cephalus, he proposes the following challenge. He says, imagine you have borrowed an axe from a friend, and your friend has become extremely distressed. Maybe they are sort of in a grip of rage, like they do not control their actions, and they have come back to you and ask you to give their axe back. Would it be appropriate to give them back the axe? And it's very illustrative what Cephalus says in reply. He refuses to reply. He says, "Oh, you young people and your conversations." You see, this is the capitulation of traditional morality. Now, traditional morality is fine as long as you don't run into complicated moral dilemmas. But as soon as there's a moral dilemma, Cephalus just throws his hands up in the air and he goes back to the sacrifices. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to think about this. If a conflict like that arises, he's completely incapable of thinking for himself. On the traditional morality tells you that you should, pay back your debts. But if your friend has become, deranged and wants their axe back, what am I going to do? Again, he just runs off into the garden to pray to the gods, right? So he refuses to ask. And with this, traditional morality is banished. And we have to see this sophistic element in Plato, this criticism of traditional morality. It's very much there. If a person is quote-unquote virtuous or pious or quote-unquote good because they simply unreflectively follow the laws, that's not real goodness. That's not real humanity. Socrates wants an argument, and Plato wants an argument, it seems. So Cephalus' son, Polemarchus, who's actually going to be killed by the 30 tyrants. Again, this dialogue has many layers of meaning. Polemarchus, who's an officer in an army, is a soldier, right? Son of Cephalus, wants to amend his father's definition. And he gives an answer, and again, it's an important answer in the history of political philosophy. He says that actually justice is patriotism. Justice is patriotism. More specifically, it means to be just is to do good to your friends and to do harm to your enemies. And again, I think in a certain basic fashion, many people would be sympathetic to this definition. Think about this. Isn't it right to do good to your friends and to do harm to your enemies? Isn't this right and good and just? Especially if you think in terms of the Peloponnesian War, Athens versus Sparta, or this Melian dialogue, the dialogue between Athens and Milos. And you see, Socrates does not say, "Oh, that's immoral." And somehow it's against the justice of Zeus for the weak to overpower the strong, for the strong to overpower the weak. That's not what Socrates says. Socrates asks, again, a question about knowledge. He says, Polemarchus, but has it ever happened to you that you thought that somebody was your friend and it turns out that they were actually secretly your enemy and would stab you in the back? Has this ever happened to you, Polemarchus? And this is I think a damn good reply. Like on the one hand, this phrase, do good to your friends and harm to your enemies, it sounds wonderful. But how do you know? How do you know who are your friends? How do you know who are your enemies? Not to mention, how do you know what is good and what is harm? No, I mean, seriously. Well, again, it's quite possible to be mistaken, to take somebody for a friend, and then they betray you. It's also quite possible to try to help someone and do something that you think is good for them, but which actually ends up harming them. And again, when Plato is going to tell us that philosophers have to rule, that in a well-ordered society, philosophers have to rule, I think that in a preliminary fashion, we need to understand this word philosopher as an expert. Somebody who has knowledge, who knows who are the friends, who knows who are the enemies, and who knows what is harm and what is goodness, right? So it's kind of primacy of expertise, primacy of philosophy, primacy of critical thinking and reflection. Almost a technocracy. We're going to talk about this in a second. So here to the scene jumps Thrasymachus, and we have anticipated that. We have been expecting an old friend, Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus says, "No, Socrates, you are wrong. Justice is simply the interest of the stronger." And again, this is from a different dialogue, but a very important sound bite, right? How in the dialogue between Socrates and Gorgias talks about how, if a doctor competes against a rhetorician for the public opinion, people will choose a rhetorician. So even when talking about disease, think about the COVID pandemic right now, right? Even when talking about issues of public health, a rhetorician will be better able to persuade people what to do rather than the doctor. And you can imagine what the answer is. Socrates' answer is always the same. Okay, he says, okay, it's fine. You're a wonderful rhetorician. You can persuade anybody. But do you yourself know? So it's like, okay, I'm an excellent liar and I'm an excellent demagogue. I can go into the public forum and I can persuade people to do what I want. But how do I know what is good for me? I mean, presumably, even if I'm a lying politician, I want the pandemic to be over. Yeah, I would imagine most politicians want that too, because they're also have some risks associated with that, right? This is kind of interesting. Again, Socrates does not dispute this directly. He doesn't say that justice is not the interest of the stronger. And again, when we get to later slides, need to be wrapping this up fairly soon. But again, it's like in Plato's ideal city, who are the rulers? The rulers are the experts, people who have knowledge. Aren't they the stronger? Isn't justice? Well, their interest also, he imagines that it's a consensual arrangement such that the interests of the stronger coincide with the interests of the city, but justice also is the interest of the stronger. It's kind of interesting because sort of we talk about this justice as paying your debts, justice as doing good to friends, harming enemies, justice, interest of the stronger. Plato, it seems, is going to incorporate all three of these definitions into his Kallipolis. But the only way, like the key prerequisite for unifying these three definitions is knowledge. Again, knowledge. And, to Thrasymachus, Socrates poses this question. He says, justice is the interest of the stronger, but do the stronger sometimes make mistakes? Don't they sometimes make laws which harm themselves? Even if you are a tyrant, you want to know what to do, how to proceed. And Socrates actually will later, when he talks in the Republic about tyranny, he talks about how the tyrant is constantly suspicious, and the tyrant kills or exiles all of his associates who are not completely loyal to him. Like, loyalty to the tyrant becomes the only criterion for getting a job, and this is really very detrimental to the city, because not competence, not merit, but loyalty become the standard. And so the tyrant loses touch with reality. Again, does this have relevance to politics outside the window? It's a good question. It's a good question. In the authoritarian regimes, it seems, again, let's talk to sociologists, social theorists. Maybe they can give us data about this. But doesn't it happen that again, the authoritarian rulers again lose touch with reality? Do not know, do not get access to, do not have access to accurate pictures of reality, and also do not think straight. Like, do not really understand what's good for them. Yeah, they can implement their will, but they do not know what is the right course of action. Anyway, so ultimately, Socrates seemingly defeats all three arguments. But is this victory? Well, not exactly. So we have two other people in the story, and these are two brothers, Glaucon and Adiamantus. And these are brothers of Plato, according to the story. And Glaucon especially tells Socrates this story. He says, okay, this is all very nice. We hear your sort of counter arguments against Thrasymachus, against the justice is the interest of the stronger. But let me tell you a story, Socrates. And this is a very, it's a very impressive, awesome, ominous story. It's the story of the ring of Gyges. The story of the ring of Gyges. It's a myth which is sort of appears in Herodotus in a slightly different guise. So Glaucon tells a story about a shepherd who, during an earthquake, accidentally stumbles upon an old grave, and in this grave he finds a ring, and when he puts this ring on his finger, he finds out that this ring makes him invisible. So this shepherd by the name of Gyges finds a ring of invisibility. And Glaucon asks Socrates, if you had a ring like that, what would you do? Oh, you keep talking about all of this ataraxia and higher pleasures and how justice, is rooted in knowledge, and the ultimate, road to happiness is philosophy. But imagine, what would you do if you had a ring of invisibility? Well, let me tell you what Gyges did. Gyges went to the palace, killed the king, and raped the queen, and became the tyrant himself. And Glaucon, kind of challenges Socrates, right? He says, basically, like, anybody, take anybody, if they had a ring of invisibility, this is exactly what they would do. And so Glaucon says, actually, justice, in this Protagorean fashion, justice is an evil. It's a necessary evil. It's like going to the dentist. Nobody goes to the dentist just for the sake of their teeth being drilled. Nobody enjoys that. It's a necessary evil to prevent a greater harm, right? Like a medical procedure. Actually, in Glaucon's speech, we have one of the earliest formulations of the idea of the social contract. That sort of, we would prefer to be unjust, but if everybody is unjust in this Protagorean fashion, again, say hi to Protagoras, society devolves into this chaos of war against all. So we have to, end up with this compromise. Agree to not commit injustice against each other because that's too terrible, although we would all prefer. But if this is the situation, of course, if you could get away with being unjust, you would. Everybody would. This is human nature. This is human nature, and again, his proof is this thought experiment. Think about what you would do if you had the ring of invisibility. And sort of the what comes next is this general picture and general idea of justice as harmony. Justice as harmony. And Socrates is going to talk about how we can imagine justice in the soul, but also justice in the city. And Socrates insists that there's a deep analogy between a just society and a just individual. And again, like, justice, first of all, is the right kind of order and is a kind of harmony. And maybe I should try to give a kind of a preliminary defense of that. Well, again, so I mean, Socrates actually says that justice is necessary for effective functioning of anything. Even a band of robbers, to be effective, they need to have some kind of justice among themselves in order to be effective, right? Or again, think back to Kallipolis. If you are simply torn apart by your desires, you do not become happy. And in general, again, I keep talking about this higher versus lower pleasures, or this normative ideal of positive freedom. And, think about the story of the Ring of Gyges. In the 21st century, we have access to quite a large degree of material abundance, which was not available before. I mean, it's not like, of course, you can become a tyrant and, rape queens and murder kings, but like in general, think about, access to pornography, buy yourself a VR headset, buy yourself a bowl of ice cream, maybe some drugs, wake up in the morning and instead of, pursuing normal course of affairs, just try to indulge every pleasure that you have. Socrates, again, when he talks to Kallipolis, has this wonderful example. Imagine that you have an itch, scratching an itch, the pleasure of scratching an itch. Is this a proper life for a human being? Just indulging in pleasures. You wake up in the morning without getting out of bed. You just stuff your face full of ice cream, shoot yourself up with some drugs, put on a VR headset, and begin to scratch the itchiest itch that you have, right? Would that be a good life? And again, it's like philosophy is not about having knockdown arguments. You can have your own opinion on the issue. But many philosophers, in fact, most philosophers we're going to talk about in our course, most philosophers are going to presuppose that this is not going to make you happy. And especially, later in the course, people like Hegel or people like Marx, their idea would be, or actually next time we'll talk about Aristotle. Aristotle has this very strong positive view, sort of positive ideal of humanity. That again, that to be happy is to be like a rose in full bloom. You have to develop your highest capacities. So it's like you wake up in the morning, and if you really want to be happy and fulfilled, what you do is you do get out of bed. You don't stuff your face with ice cream, but you follow a certain regimen of proper dietary habits. You engage in physical exercise. You exercise your body in order to be healthy. You exercise your mind. You go read a book. You go and you try to do something meaningful with your life. And especially again for Aristotle, this would necessarily entail engaging in collaborative activities with others. Like maybe you are trying to write a book or write a song or create something, even make a video game. But this requires collaboration with other people. And you are working on, you're producing something great and interesting that makes your life worthwhile. And which is different from just, lying in bed and stuffing your face full of ice cream. This, Socrates would say, this does not really make you happy. And again, this assertion that tyrant is the unhappiest of all people. And again, it's like, I'm not, maybe, should we take this seriously? I think there's definitely something to it. And again, there's no such thing as a knockdown argument in philosophy. But I have to tell you, it's always horrible to give biographical examples, but I have to tell you from my own experience, I do not enjoy life, on the days when I do not get out of bed. Like, if you do an experiment, see whether it works for you or not. Okay. So, the city-soul analogy, we'll talk about this more in the seminar, so justice, harmony. Yeah, so I should be wrapping this up. In fact, I only have maybe several slides left, so don't worry too much. So, Socrates says the following thing. In order to really understand what is justice, we need to understand what is harmony. And he says the best way to do this is to start with the city, because it's bigger and it's kind of a more vivid example. And then talking from the city, taking the analogy back to the individual soul, individual person. And Socrates actually begins with, I think, with a very interesting example. He says, imagine what he calls a healthy city. He talks about a small agricultural commune, And immediately, I think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and I think of Karl Marx. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau will talk about these small rural communes, and Karl Marx is going to talk about primitive communism. Socrates talks about how cities naturally arise because human beings are not self-sufficient. We cannot provide for all our needs ourselves. And in fact, again, we keep talking about this, how children die if they're not taken care of by parents, and people in general benefit from each other, right? And so you have this small agricultural commune with primitive division of labor. It's simple, it's self-sufficient. And Socrates is even talking about how, in principle, it's fairly safe. And Rousseau is going to have the same point. Because you don't have a lot of luxury, you don't have a lot of money, there's not much to steal. Other people are not even very interested in attacking you. And Socrates imagines that this is a stable, primitive condition. And again, say hi to Karl Marx's ideal of primitive communism, right? But Glaucon, Glaucon doesn't like that. He jumps in and he says, this is a city of pigs. And when he says this, he specifically means that they are so primitive, so poor. Again, this ataraxia, pleonexia, this is an ataraxic city. They do not have luxuries, and they do not need luxuries to be happy. And specifically, he says, they have no roasted meat. They do not have enough land for pasture. They are, simple, sufficient vegetarians. But Glaucon says, I want meat. And Socrates replies to that, well, okay, you want meat, you want luxury, this is going to make an inflamed city. And again, looking, it's kind of different philosophers are going to have a different take on this, especially somebody like Hegel or somebody like Marx would say that it's good that humanity does not stay on the level of primitive hippie communes. Because yes, people want luxury, and luxury leads to war and conflict. We're going to talk about this in a second. But also this luxury and surplus, economic surplus, leads to development. So can you have philosophers in this healthy city, this primitive hippie commune? Probably not, because most of the time people are engaged in work. But in this fevered city, you will have luxury and you will have philosophers. But it is an inflamed city. So now you try to conquer more land, control more land, and you will have surplus, you will have free time, you will have luxury, and therefore you will need an army. So I have written at the bottom of the slide, so again, this William Guthrie, again, an important historian of ancient Greek philosophy, he talks about how in small communities, again, justice is very natural, against kind of this catchphrase, that the best place to store your food is in your neighbor's stomach. That in small primitive communities, you don't get this sophistic problem of conflict of interest between society and the individual, because it's just that, again, in primitive societies, they're too tied together, too closely linked to one another, right? Again, like if I cheat on my, I cheated on my neighbor today, but tomorrow I will need their help. to defend from wild animals or from incursion from the outside, and we're very small. Like, free rider problem does not appear in a small primitive community. But as communities become large, and as communities become hierarchical and stratified, this is where you get the free rider problem. And this is our inflamed city. And especially, again, you need an army. And so the biggest problem with an army is the following. You need soldiers who are loyal. You need soldiers who shoot first, ask questions later. And so, immediately, so if you want to have a society like that, Socrates says, war, I'm not going to say that war is a good thing. Socrates like explicitly refuses to make a moral judgment. He says, I'm not going to say that war is a moral thing, but war is necessary. You know, if you're going to have something to steal, if you're going to have something worth stealing, you're going to have to protect it. And if you're going to have to protect it, you're going to have a functioning army. And a functioning army is going to have to be like dogs, people who automatically attack anybody who's not from the city, but protect people within the city. And notice, you want your army to be effective, but you also don't want your army to tyrannize your own population. You don't want the army to perform a coup, like a military, and install a military dictatorship. So, in order to have an effective army, you also need a class of rulers. Well, Socrates is going to call them philosopher kings and queens. Very importantly, again, Socrates, in this sense, believes in equality of opportunity for men and women. In general, it seems that Plato and Socrates had a very high opinion of potential for intelligence and philosophy in both sexes. Like, he saw no reason to have a glass ceiling. Like, at the end of the day, what really matters, again, so we're talking about the kind of meritocracy or technocracy, that rule by the best, rule by the most capable, and it doesn't really matter what your gender is. What really counts is, do you have the requisite knowledge, do you have the requisite skill? Anyway, so in this ideal Kallipolis, beautiful city in Greek, you have the reason which rules, and reason is embodied in these philosopher kings and queens. It's not philosopher kings in the plural. It's not one person. It's a group of people. It's a class of people. And they have to control the soldiers. And in order for this whole arrangement to work, you also need producers who will produce material wealth. This criticized later in Plato's dialogue Parmenides. And this is about the theory of forms. Okay, sometimes. This is actually from a different slide. It's no good. Yeah. Let me just delete this. Yeah. Anyway, so this is the basic structure of the city, and the idea is that, again, city-soul analogy, that in a just individual, reason has to rule. And spirit and appetite, and again, spirit, when we talk about spirit, is this quality associated with soldiers, some like boldness, bravery, zeal, moral zeal, those kinds of qualities. And it's kind of interesting because when we talk about these three classes, the idea is that each person in the three classes, like each person in general, like people in general, are driven in life by desires and passions. And so philosophers have passion for knowledge, soldiers have passion for glory, and producers have passion for appetite. But this is kind of an interesting problem for all sorts of reasons. So first of all, philosophers do not want to rule. And this is why Plato believes that most states are bad, and this is why he also believes that his own society is going to be hard to create and hard to sustain. Because in it, philosophers do not want to rule. They do not want to rule. Ideally, they want to do philosophy because their passion is for knowledge and not for political rule. Go back to this example from Gyges, rhetorician fighting against the doctor. The doctor is not a rhetorician. The doctor, presumably a good doctor, loves medicine, not rhetoric, right? So he's not interested, he or she, a good doctor is not interested in developing rhetorical skill. So he or she will not be good at rhetoric. That's a problem. And you see this idea of politics as a necessary evil, because in this state, soldiers and producers, soldiers are ruled by spirit, producers are ruled by appetite. So it seems that 2/3 of the population are technically unjust and, in an important sense, inhuman. Wow, that's an ideal city. Not to mention that, again, in order to control the soldiers and the producers, you're going to have Plato talks about the noble lie and censorship of how you're going to, again, because in order to provide for the proper education for the soldiers, you will need to have this indoctrination and myths, again, effective ideology. Partly because they are not philosophers, they will not be able to understand. And again, and this is, again, I don't think that Socrates glorifies this. This is a necessary evil. And you could ask this question, could you have a society only of philosophers? And the answer is no. Because a society of only philosophers will not be able to defend itself. So, and Plato talks about eugenics. It's a very dark and depressive thought. But the idea is that, in some sense, well, again, there's this thing called eugenic lottery, that philosopher kings and queens are going to arrange marriages in the city allegedly through a secret lottery, to make sure that there's enough soldiers and enough producers in the city. And we are talking about meritocracy in the sense that Plato says if a child is born with sufficient ability among the producers or among the soldiers, this child will be reared as a future philosopher. So it's like, in this sense, we're talking about meritocracy. The rule of merit, the rule of people who have abilities. But at the same time, again, you want to breed enough people with soldier souls and producer souls to make the city sustainable. And again, it's not pretty, and I think Socrates realizes it's not pretty. But again, his contention is this is necessary. This is necessary. And it's kind of this problem is going to plague political philosophy for the centuries to come. And again, Marx is going to have a solution to this, world communism and end to war. But is this a realistic solution? That's a complicated question. Okay. And well, ultimately, I need to wrap this up as fast as possible. So I think the big question is that the big problem or assumption on which Plato relies is that the philosophers will know how to rule. And the question is, how are they going to acquire this knowledge? And the problem is twofold. Is there such a knowledge in general, and how can you acquire it? And Plato, again, has this theory of forms, or theory of ideas, which, well, probably theory of forms is a better technical term. And I'm not sure, I need to try to explain this. And this theory of forms is actually going to be criticized in Plato's later dialogue, Parmenides. So does Plato actually believe in his own theory of forms? That's not a clear question. But again, this general idea that there's this ideal world in which you have perfect blueprints of things down here below, and that by doing things such as mathematics and geometry, you can arrive at this world of ideas, and especially of this idea of ideas or idea of the good. I'm not going to explain this very well because we're really short on time. But ultimately, I think the point is, and again, this is where we see the example of Plato as a sophist. Does Plato know? Is he sure that forms actually exist? This perfect knowledge. And again, 2,500 years have passed since Plato, and we don't seem to have found it. And does the knowledge of technical arts, does knowledge of things like mathematics, does it grant political expertise? This is not clear. This is not clear. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it seems to me that this is my argument for thinking of Plato as a sophist. So if we compare Plato to Kant and to Protagoras, it seems that we are, especially when we talk about this noble lie, it seems to some extent that Plato postulates the existence of the universal standard of morality, not because he knows that there's objective rule of good and evil, but because in a Protagorean fashion, in a sophistic fashion, he understands that you have to lie to people, to mislead them, to tell them that there is an objective standard of morality. for political reasons, for political purposes. And again, so Kant has this very famous idea of how we do not know whether God exists or not, but we have to postulate the existence of God in order for our morality to work. And it could be, very well could be, that Plato is doing something like this here. And I think, this is a very controversial assertion on my part, but I think if you read Plato's dialogues, especially the Republic, I think it's very clear, because Socrates is kind of careful. He does not put on this prophetic hat. Socrates doesn't say, oh, I have the knowledge of the truth. It seems to be a working hypothesis, or sometimes he uses the phrase of a likely account, right? And so, especially for us, in the later lectures, in the later topics that we're going to discuss, this question is going to be very important. Is there political knowledge? Is there really such a thing as political expertise? Is there a right, single, objective answer to the political question? Rousseau, for example, is going to talk about the general will. So Rousseau presupposes, well, let's say we have the COVID pandemic right now, that we assume that there's the right answer, the right single right conclusion of what is the right thing to do for a society. But if we imagine, a Kallipolis story that Kallipolis is going to say that no, actually there's fundamental conflict in society, maybe there's no such thing as a single right answer. That there's one thing which is good, let's say, for the rulers, another thing which is good for the ruled. Or, one thing that's good for one group of people, another thing that's good for another group of people. So again, Plato presupposes that there's a single, unified, best thing, best solution that will kind of create this utopian condition. But is there, again, this is a very strong assumption on Plato's part about nature of humanity, nature of human happiness, but also nature of human society. And so again, sometimes Plato would talk about aristocracy, but maybe meritocracy or technocracy is a better word. And let me probably leave you with this slide. Again, this idea that Plato wants a kind of meritocracy or technocracy because he imagines or assumes or hopes or maybe creates this noble lie that there is technical expertise, but and his opponents, the sophists, they would defend a democratic way of life because they would say, no, there is no such thing as this objective mathematical knowledge of what is the right thing to do in society. And so what we have to do instead, again, sophists like Protagoras, consensual sophists who want us to engage in productive dialogue, they would say that, in fact, because there is no knowledge of what is the single best thing for all human beings, instead, we have to engage in dialogue. And this would be a prima facie, at the first sight, this would be a justification of democracy. Again, Socrates does not like democracy. Again, it's like his ideal city is ruled by the wise. And how do you know who are the wise? You know it through the exams, not through voting. But basically, Protagoras is going to say, yeah, but how do you know that your exams are fair? Who makes the exams? Who makes sure that that the exams are actually sort of test the thing that you want to test? Is there such a thing as political expertise? And do your exam test that? And instead, I think somebody like Protagoras would say that we can never trust the government with so much power to decide on what are the exams for political expertise. And so if you follow this fallibilist and somewhat skeptical path, you end up with the necessity of open-ended dialogue. And this would be a prima facie argument for democracy. And that's not what Plato is advocating. That's not what Plato is advocating. But, and maybe I should give Plato, nevertheless, the last word. At the end of the day, there is an interesting idea in Plato, in Plato's Republic. Because as they are talking, as they're sitting there and they're discussing this wonderful political arrangement, aristocratic arrangement, right? Well, I don't want to say aristocratic, but technocratic, meritocratic arrangement, ruled by philosopher, kings and queens through technical expertise. A question comes up. And actually Socrates brings up this issue. He says that, there are different regimes. There are democracies, there are oligarchies, there are tyrannies. But actually, at the end of the day, it seems that the only place in which you can engage in this kind of discussion that we are having right now, that Socrates is having right now, the only place in which you can discuss, the only regime in which you can discuss what is the best regime is the democratic regime. So with all of his aristocratic sentiments, with all of his aristocratic connections, and with all this leaning towards meritocracy, Plato, through the mouth of Socrates, acknowledges that the only place in which you can really ask this question of the value of philosophy and to engage in this open-ended discussion is democratic Athens. Democracy, in this sense, provides a necessary basis, a necessary framework for doing philosophy in general. That's an interesting thought. It's not necessarily the deepest or the most important thought in the Republic, but let me leave you with this. It's a very pregnant dialogue in many ways. It's like pregnant with many ideas. You can take it in many different ways. So, but let me pause here because we've been probably going for too long right now. Okay, colleagues. So I kind of apologize. This was probably slightly longer than I planned, but I did want to get out the most important ideas. So I hope that this was stimulating. I hope this definitely gives you some food for thought. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you so very much for bearing with me for so long. I'll probably see you, I'll see you in Teams right now, or if not, I'll see you in the seminars on Monday and Tuesday. Okay, colleagues. Okay, thank you. And, well, no. Most importantly, now you understand the meaning of this phrase. Most importantly, take care. Care of the soul. The ultimate end of philosophizing.